Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Super Cheese video. And we spend a lot of time on this channel talking about the best specializations in World of Warcraft for PvP and what they can give to you. And we don't really spend a lot of time or attention on the specializations that could use a helping hand. So today's video is going to cover 7 PvP specs that absolutely need buffs. It's going to be going into the specifics of their mechanics or their class balance tuning that are really preventing them from shining as these specializations deserve to shine. So let's get started here. These aren't in a super particular order because, you know, priority in terms of what needed to be buffed is a little tough to do, but they are slightly in order. So the first one here coming in at the number 7 position is going to be the Marksmanship Hunter. Now, Hunters notoriously for almost all 3 specializations, if not all 3 specializations, are very flimsy defensively. Survival of the fittest, Roar of Sacrifice. These are defensive cooldowns that on this class feel pretty much non-consequential. A lot of players will just jump on you and ignore those defensive cooldowns, and it's becoming increasingly more and more of a problem, especially when, you know, stability of defense is like the #1 most desirable thing to have in PvP. And Hunters, and most notably Marksmanship Hunters, because of their stationary nature, which is another thing added on to that, has put them in this position where they really need some type of defensive buff. I think recently the change so that their root traps are on DR with each other has made it so that Hunters can't really enable kiting to be their main option to escape most of their attackers. It becomes, you know, most melee DPS have ways to get out of roots, and they're stuck in like a DR route. It's not really that big of a deal in order to be able to then reconnect onto the Hunter, especially the best melee DPS. Now, of course, there are melee DPS that are going to be on this list that don't have the same type of mobility of a Demon Hunter to be able to stick to a Marksmanship Hunter, but for those classes that do, it is very oppressive in order to play this class. And obviously the stationary nature, not being able to do a lot of your damage on the move. And recently the armor changes have seemingly not done a lot for Marksmanship Hunter. Recently, they reduced the armor of plate classes, buffed up the armor of cloth classes, and I haven't really felt that change on my Marksmanship Hunter. Plate classes still feel almost completely untargetable, and cloth targets still, you know, pretty juicy target to be able to attack. So it is situationally good, which is why it's coming towards the bottom end of the list. But I think defensively, this class definitely needs a type of buff. I would ultimately like to see it get some type of rework moving into the future. I think that it's mechanically dated a little bit when we look at how modernized other specializations are, like the Ret Paladin patch and Havoc Demon Hunters as well. It just feels like you're playing with some ancient tech, like you're fighting with slingshots against players that are using like laser guns and stuff like that. So it's a little bit dated. We'd like to see it updated, but that's something that's probably like a long-term investment, I would think, as opposed to just buffing up the numbers on their defensive cooldowns. Would be something that would go in the direction of making Marksmanship Hunter a little bit more viable. Coming in at the number 6 position is the Assassination Rogue. I know we shouldn't show any pity to rogue specs given how powerful Outlaw Rogues and Subtlety Rogues are at the moment, but Assassination Rogues do not benefit from some of the major components that Outlaw and Subtlety do benefit from, which is mostly the cooldown reduction oriented around basically their entire kit and also their limited mobility in comparison. But most notably is that their most powerful cooldown death mark for most specializations in the game have an almost immediate counter that can completely negate it for how significantly long of a cooldown it is. And then toppled on top of that, the mechanics that deny their death mark usually also deny their bleeds, so it's in general a complete reset to their damage. If you use a Blessing of Protection on a death mark and remove all the duplicated bleeds, you've put that Assassination Rogue, like, I don't even know mathematically, like 15 global cooldowns behind for 1 global cooldown. Or if you're an Evoker and you use the Dispel to remove bleed mechanics, again, you've put the Assassination Rogue behind like 15 global cooldowns. And I feel like Assassination Rogue's in this spot where in most cases where these counters are available, it is just better to not use your cooldown, because if you do and it gets countered, you're put way more globals behind than if you did actually commit to using the cooldown. So obviously I think that likely means that this cooldown either needs to be reworked or it needs to have some sort of negative backlash effect, like Unstable Affliction. So if Death Mark is removed, perhaps the target takes a significant amount of shadow damage or something. So that way there is like a bit of risk to trying to remove that cooldown, and the rogue does ultimately get at least some value from the cooldown instead of just being completely negated and removed. That is the most frustrating part, at least offensively. Defensively, you're always going to be examining it against Outlaw and Subtlety, and it just doesn't have the same type of defense. You don't have the grappling hook of the Outlaw Rogue to be able to move it around. You don't have the cooldown reduction to be able to get access to more vanishes more rapidly. So defensively, it's just noticeably weaker. But I would say ultimately the main frustrating pain point is the fact that Deathmark can be so easily removed from classes with pretty much no punishment. It's very similar to how, Warlocks were feeling in the past with their dots being spam dispelled by things like Feign Death and Greater Fade Dispel. So I would like to see something aimed towards Deathmark and adding some sort of backlash effect to it being removed of significance. Number 5 is the Disc Priest. Now, I don't think it's good to have any healer that's in a position where it feels weak right now, because obviously for solo shuffle, it's dependent on people queuing healer. So if there's people who like playing a specific healer and it's not viable, that's going to reduce the number of queues available in the bracket. I think that Disc Priest, I have fun on it. I think it's the most fun healer, and it's honestly decently represented, at least on the solo shuffle ladder, but it is definitely on the weaker side, especially when it comes to mana regeneration, as well as throughput, but mostly mana regeneration. This is kind of the name of the game right now when you're fighting against things like Resto Shamans that seemingly have infinite mana, which debatably should be nerfed, but this video is again talking about buffing. For Disc Priest, I noticed having lost Solace, which was an on-use active ability which gave you a little bit of mana regeneration back. I would like to see the game shift to a point where healers aren't even allowed to drink in arena and they have more in-combat methods of trying to out-mana the other healer, and Solace was one of those mechanics, and I'm kind of sad to have seen it gone. Obviously, this is not going to be the game-breaking reason why Disc Priest isn't viable, but I think it was a fun playstyle thing that is now missing from the specialization. And I'd like to see something else incorporated so it's got this active mana management oriented around it. But overall, its throughput seems very low. I've seen lots of cases where targets will die through pain suppression even. Disc Priest might be in a position where pain suppression even needs a buff of like 10% additional damage reduction, because it is quite insane the amount of times I've seen players just go down through pain suppression. It's very similar to how it feels when you pop the Hunter defensive cooldown, Survival of the Fittest, just absolutely get flatlined. So defensive cooldowns don't feel super impactful in terms of guaranteeing that they can keep their allies alive. And then if you do somehow manage to keep your allies alive, you are most likely going to run out of mana way faster than every other healer, which likely just means a passive mana regeneration buff is really in order for Discipline Priest to feel more competitively viable, at least out of everything right now. For Disc Priest, I would say that the mana regen buff is the biggest thing. Coming in at number 4 is going to be the Frost Death Knight. Now, the main problem with Frost Death Knight is that it is a one-trick class where you either know how to do its combo and its burst damage, or you're totally useless. One of the main things contributing to that is that almost 60+%, I want to say 80% of your damage is Obliterate. It's all coming from one ability and nothing else. Your dot damage is seemingly no impact whatsoever, and you don't really have like a fully developed kit, as well as your ability damage profile not being broken down and displaced evenly makes it so you have to find those very specific windows, which can be both frustrating to fight against and frustrating for the Frost Death Knight if they're not able to set up those situations. So I would really like to see them buff up the dot damage, maybe bring down the Obliterate damage, maybe bring up Frost Strike damage, and try and get their details damage breakdown to be more evenly displaced in terms of their overall damage, and focus them a little bit more towards sustained damage, so you don't feel like you have to just run away before you've got your Death Grip and your Syndergosis done every time. So it feels like you can actively engage in the combat of a fight without feeling like you're actually hindering your team by participating in combat. I don't think that is a great place for Frost Death Knight to be. Moving into the future, I'd really like to see them incorporate some type of new honor talent that gives them some type of crowd control, something maybe on a polymorph diminishing return. They used to have abilities like Chill Streak, or not Chill Streak, what was it? Hungering Cold from Cataclysm. Now, that original version was pretty powerful. It was instant cast AoE polymorph. I'm thinking something more like maybe you put a debuff on a target after a certain amount of time, it gets encased in ice on a polymorph DR, something like a diamond ice trap from a hunter. Give them some type of crowd control and tactical play while displacing out their damage, so that they can feel like more of a well-rounded class. That's something, again, that I wouldn't expect to happen until later, like maybe a next expansion thing, but I definitely think bringing down the Obliterate damage, bringing up their dot damage and their Frost Strike damage would go a long way to making it feel a lot less like a one-trick specialization and feeling more viable in terms of actually engaging in combat actively outside of its cooldowns. Coming in at the number 3 position is the Feral Druid. Now, Feral Druid right now, the one thing that it does have going for it is the Heart of the Wild fast cast clones. But even then, getting interrupted, having to shapeshift out of form, getting caught out of form can be very dangerous for Feral Druid at the moment. And again, defensively, it is not in a good spot. I think one thing that has happened now over time is that cooldowns like Incarnation have gone down to 2 minutes. Cooldowns like Metamorphosis for Demon Hunter have gone down to 2 minutes. But Feral Druid's Survival Instincts is still a 3-minute cooldown, which is now misaligned with those 2-minute timers for a lot of powerful offensive cooldowns, and it's honestly not that strong of a defensive for being a 3-minute cooldown. I think Survival Instincts could stand to go down to being a 2-minute cooldown. It's kind of just an immediate exchange in terms of defensive power for the specialization right now. That would be one thing that would help it survive. And then another is maybe some type of, they nerfed the bear form armor and they buffed up the regrowth healing, but you still feel just really squishy. Survival Instincts for sure going down to 2 minutes would feel better. Something needs to be done about just like the passive mitigation. I don't know if it's that they need a talent like what they just gave to Shaman, which is like extra magic damage reduction towards themselves to try and make them a little bit more durable. But when you're looking at them relative to pretty much almost any melee DPS in the game, they're like the easiest melee DPS to take down. And you can see that on the graphs for Solo Shuffle, where, this is the spec that typically dies first of any spec in the game in PvP. So some type of passive defensive mitigation likely towards magic damage, as magic damage is more prevalent than in physical damage, as well as bringing Survival Instincts down to a 2-minute cooldown, I think would be a good immediate change to remedying some of the problems for Feral Druid and making them more competitively viable. Coming in at the number 2 position is the Fury Warrior. Now, Fury Warrior, it's a pretty simple and straightforward spec, really great for beginners. Just hammer out your buttons and do a lot of damage. The problem is the a lot of damage part. It's just not even close to the amount of numbers that Demon Hunter can put out, and if it's not able to keep up even close with the amount of damage that Demon Hunter puts out, it kind of just feels like an inferior Demon Hunter. With more limited mobility and more limited crowd control. It just feels like a weaker option and almost like a clone specialization. So the tuning on this just needs to come up if it's going to feel better. It's got other advantages like Intervene, which can be better for into things like rogues, but its damage is just so far off where it needs to be to compete with Demon Hunter is that I just don't see it happening. So bringing up Rampage likely, again, is going to be something that is required for this. Maybe even bringing up some of the damage on Odin's Fury's Bleed to try and amp up its pressure overall would be a good move. I'm still frustrated by the fact that the I believe it's Slaughterhouse stacks, where you stack up your Mortal Strike effect. If there's already a persisting Mortal Strike effect, it just doesn't get applied to the target, even though yours is technically stronger at maximum stacks, which makes it a little frustrating. It was nice with the quality of life where now Odin's Fury applies it, so you can charge in and maybe get your stacks up a bit faster. But I would still like it to be made possible to have your MS be superior to other MSs, regardless if it's stacked up or not, because it's a bit frustrating. So just this one's a pretty simple one. Just have to bring up the numbers. The numbers aren't high enough on the damage profile. And for quality of life, I'd really like it so the Mortal Strike effect can stack even regardless if there's a persisting Mortal Strike effect already on the target. It should just be able to like supersede that effect and persist by itself. And the number 1 spec for buffs is a specialization that I played yesterday and was really infuriated playing it, which is the Enhancement Shaman. Now, Enhancement Shaman, the number 1 pain point for me with this one is mobility. You've got things like Spirit Walk, which removes a root temporarily, and then you're almost immediately re-snared because there's constant snares and roots just coming out of every class all the time in PvP. So it feels like, that mechanic in order to reconnect to a target is really unreliable. Things like Feral Lunge are also kind of just not great. It's basically just Blade Rush or Fell Blade from Demon Hunter, and then that's it. Like, you can go Ghost Wolf, but it's not really doing a lot. You ain't moving really fast. You've got to use the global to get into it, and then you got to get out of it. And it feels like mobility and trying to get to your target is just really tilting. The next main point of pain is Flame Shock dispels. It seems like there is no dispel protection on Flame Shock. Even as Ellie, I played Ellie yesterday, but Enhance especially, with playing the Primordial Wave and needing to keep Flame Shocks on multiple targets in order to stack up your stats. There's basically no punishment at all for just sitting there and spam dispelling Flame Shock, and things like the Immolation Aura dispel for Demon Hunter is just exacerbating that issue. They're just constantly removing your Flame Shock. You're not able to get the moments where you need to get these Primordial Wave setups, so you're really limited on mobility, struggling to hit your target, and then the abilities you apply from range are just constantly being dispelled, and you're just put in this position where you just feel like you're completely being neutered throughout the game, and you can't get anything going in terms of your class. So I would really like to see some changes towards its mobility. mobility. And in the past, Enhancement Shaman had things that would make it desirable, like Windwalk Totem, which made it suppressed all snares on the whole team and allowed everybody to move really quickly. This could be a great way for enabling Enhancement Shaman as like a support role, because Enhancement Shaman is more of a support class, bringing back some type of Windwalk mechanic or Windwalk Totem mechanic to the game, so that way it can grant mobility to its allies as well. Maybe you got a caster that's getting trained down by melee, you drop that totem, you can assist them and help them escape. Something to do with mobility though, whether that even be buffing Spirit Walk to potentially suppress snares during the duration, so that you're able to get into Ghost Wolf, move faster than just immediately being re-snared. Maybe not immune to roots, but at least suppress the snares. It's just mobility. And then like team utility in order to like help your teammates, and the dispel protection that really needs to be looked at for Enhancement Shaman. But that's it here for my list of the 7 specs that I think need buffs. What are the pain points? What is exactly that I would like to do with the specializations in order to help them out, increase their viability, so we get more classes in the game, because we all know that the game is the most fun when there's the most variety of specs to queue into and not just one class or one particular comp. So I thought this was an important video to share and talk about, so I hope that you'd enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a thumbs up, comment down below with your thoughts. What are the classes that you think need the most buffs? What is it about them that have specific pain points? And other than that, thank you very much for watching the video. I will see you in the next one.